It's April 1st, 2018. Top 16 for Street Fighter V at NorCal Regionals 2018 is underway, and two very strong players are about to face off against each other. Punk and Problem X. Punk is playing Karen. Good idea. That's a very strong character who he happens to be very good at. Problem X is playing Abigail. And for reasons we're about to find out, that is a very, very good idea. Now, you might be wondering why I'm telling you any of this. I usually don't go for this kind of storytime shtick. We usually just dive straight into the character in the video game and why they're an absolute fucking mess. However, there's a beautiful moment after game 1 of this set that I think perfectly encapsulates the absolute state of this character that I had to share. Here's Problem X after game 1. And here's Punk after game 1. After winning game 1. Winning game 1 against the absolute nightmare that was Season 3 Abigail. Now, the general consensus is that in the final version of Street Fighter V, Abigail is one of the game's weakest characters, if not the weakest character in the game overall. But Abigail is no victim of circumstance. He's as weak as he is because he has been paying for his sins over the years, and most of those sins were committed in the first few months of Street Fighter V Arcade Edition. Now, Abigail was by no means a bad character upon his debut in Season 2. He definitely had some obvious weaknesses, and he was a little bit unexplored, maybe partially due to his terrible reception.
No one wanted you!
But he definitely had potential. However, for whatever reason, he was maybe the single most buff character going into Season 3, and he was hilariously overtuned. The version of Abigail in the game from January 16th, 2018 to April 3rd, 2018 is maybe the single strongest character in Street Fighter V's history. Well, minus whatever the fuck this was, but I don't know, that doesn't really count. Luckily, thanks to this very legally obtained copy of Street Fighter V Arcade Edition, I can physically show you a lot of what made Abigail so fucked up and nasty in this version of the game. First of all, we'll talk about Arcade Edition Abigail and the things exclusive to him that made him such a powerful character. And then to wrap things up, we'll talk about how he was nerfed over the years and how he wound up in the final version of the game. Just to clarify, if I'm showing footage on this training stage, we're looking at Arcade Edition Abigail. And if I'm showing footage on this version of the grid, then we're talking about Abigail as he appeared in the final version of Street Fighter V.
Abigail!
First of all, let's get some basic stuff out the way. At the time, Abigail had 1,100 health and 1,050 stun. That might not sound that unreasonable, because that's only 25 more health than he has in the final version of the game, but you gotta remember this was before the Champion Edition patch, which gave most characters an extra 25 health. At the time, Abigail had 50 more health than the character with the second highest health, that being Zangief, who had 1,050. On top of having so much health, Abigail was a character with a disgustingly good 2-bar V-trigger, crush counters that built half a bar V-gauge, or 2/3 of a bar for crush counter sweep, and a genuinely good V-skill that built over half a bar of V-gauge when it worked. Everything I mentioned before hitting Akuma was nerfed at some point, but at the time, Abigail could pop V-trigger and still have like 75% of his health ready to rock. It was absolutely vile. If Abigail landed a forward throw in the corner, he wouldn't get pushed back at all. He's plus 18 on Quick Rise, and he could very easily walk back in and get another mix-up. Now, granted, this isn't an Abigail exclusive problem. It wasn't until the Season 3.5 patch in April where Capcom really started to do anything about throw loops, but still, it was a fucked up thing, and he had it, so I think it's worth mentioning. While the Arcade Edition patch was the one that applied extra scaling to V-trigger cancels when used in combos, the same wouldn't be done for crush counters until the April patch. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say this was good for Abigail, mainly due to his absurdly high damage and the absolute state of standing heavy punch. Let's move on to Abigail's light normals, because weirdly enough, they're some of the most egregious parts of his kit. First of all, Abigail's stand jab was a functional anti-air. This might not seem like a big deal, but considering the context of Street Fighter V Arcade Edition, this is absolutely wild. Now, Abigail's stand jab is not the most consistent or rewarding anti-air in the world, but it doesn't really need to be. Abigail can afford the occasional trade, and if it works, the opponent lands right in front of Abigail, which is exactly what he wants. Honestly, the most egregious thing about this anti-air is the fact that it exists at all. In case you didn't know, one of the main goals of the Arcade Edition patch was to remove anti-air jabs across the board, and for the most part that's exactly what they did. Alex's stand jab, for example, was probably his best anti-air in Season 2. But in Season 3, it was completely gutted as an anti-air, and basically served no purpose. This was a massive nerf to Alex, because while they're fantastic in the final version of SF5, at the time his other anti-air options were atrocious. That was EX Knee, a move that in the final version of SF5 has frame 1 invincibility against air attacks and always gives Oki, neither of which are true here. I promise I won't go on an Alex tangent, and in the final version of the game, Alex is a much better character than Abigail, so calmer I guess, but god, it's just really funny that the same patch that massively overtuned Abigail looked at bottom tier Alex, removed one of his most important tools, gave him no meaningful buffs, and a completely useless V-trigger too. Just keep him at the back of your mind, okay? Anyways, back to Abigail. A big part of what makes his stand jab so strange in this version of the game is the fact that going from Season 2 to Season 3, it was actually improved as an anti-air. This is so strange because it kind of just goes against one of the main goals of the Arcade Edition patch. It's a pretty blatant change. It's kind of like they almost wanted this character to be top tier no matter what. Funnily enough, Crouching Heavy Punch was also massively buffed as an anti-air going into Season 3. It gave a way more lenient juggle state, meaning it was much more rewarding. It was a frame faster, going from 12 frame startup to 11 frame startup, and it had way better upper body invincibility. He also had his high parry, which was very important for late anti-airs since it was active on frame 3. Obviously, it relies on the opponent hitting you to actually work as an anti-air, so it got toasted by empty jumps, but once again, this is another anti-air that got buffed in the Season 3 patch, since it gave a more linear juggle state than it did in Season 2. Forward Heavy Punch was also buffed as an anti-air going into Season 3, getting a smaller hurtbox and a larger hitbox. But at the time at least, this one didn't matter so much. It wasn't a terrible anti-air or anything, just not as consistently rewarding or as consistent in general. You saw this a lot more in the later seasons of Street Fighter V, after Stand Jab got nerfed as an anti-air, because, you know, he had to make do with what he had. Either way, Abigail having an anti-air jab is far from the only thing wrong with his light normals, so let's move on. Season 2 Abigail was very unique in that he got no traditional confirm at all off his fastest normal. His only 4-frame button was his crouching light kick, and at the time, it was only +3 on hit. If you wanted any kind of traditional light confirm, your best bet was his 5-frame standing light punch. A massive weakness for sure, but not unreasonable given the kind of character he is. It was honestly pretty neat. Season 3 said fuck that and gave Abigail maybe the best light confirms in the game. Going from Season 2 to Season 3, Abigail's crouching light kick went from +3 on hit to +5, so it can now link into itself. But on top of that, crouching light punch and standing light kick went from 6-frame startup to 5-frame startup, so you could easily link into them as well. These changes gave you a confirm to light Abigail punch, or a 3-hit light confirm into EX Abigail punch. Against a crouching opponent, you could even get a 3-hit light confirm into light Abigail punch. But come on now, you're a Season 3 Abigail player. You ain't got time for things like reacting to what the opponent is doing. You're here to push buttons. Another notable thing about Abigail's light confirms is that they're just strong. Most characters' lights in Street Fighter V do 30 damage, with their crouching light kicks usually doing 20. All of Abigail's do 40 except for stand light kick, which does 50. And also, Abigail Punch is just a good combo ender. The light one does 120 if you mash, and the EX does 170. And obviously having a 3-hit light confirm helps your damage, and 3-hit light confirms were exceptionally rare at this point in the game's lifespan. There's one more light normal that's definitely worth talking about, and that's crouching light punch. This move is infamous for being an incredible poke, and technically speaking, this patch features the best version of that poke for 2 simple reasons. The first reason is very simple. This is the only patch where it's a 5-frame normal instead of a 6-frame normal. Although, to be fair, from a little further out, it still hits on frame 6. The second reason is a little bit harder to convey, but it's still very important. Abigail's crouching light punch barely extended his hurtbox before the hitbox appeared. This move shut a lot of characters down. It was really, really annoying, and if you can believe it, this aspect of it wasn't nerfed until Season 5. Now, there is one other incredibly fucked up aspect of Abigail's light normals, although, to be fair, this is less an issue with his light normals and more an issue with something else in his kit. For whatever reason, Abigail can tick into his light or EX command grab after 2 blocked light normals. All of Abigail's command grabs have significantly more range than they do in the final version of SF5. It's actually kind of incredible. That's the heavy version, which basically only hits point blank in the final version of SF5. Being in range for a command grab after 2 blocked light normals is very rare in Street Fighter V, and at the time, the only characters who could do it were Birdie with his EX command grab, or Zangief with light or EX SPD. The craziest part of all this is that Abigail's command grab was arguably even more rewarding than Zangief's. His light command grab did the exact same damage and stun, but gave a better knockdown, and his EX command grab, while not throw invincible like Zangief's, was way more flexible because of the juggle state it put the opponent in. Even the follow-up to EX command grab that sacrificed damage for Oki did more damage and stun than Zangief's EX SPD, while also having great corner carry. Abigail in the final version of SF5 is not a grappler, and you can tell he was never meant to be a grappler. He's a brawler, a character with high health, huge normals, and good pressure who just happens to have a command grab that he can occasionally sneak in to remind you that you can't block forever. But in this version of the game, thanks to how overtuned he was and the state of the game's actual grapplers, he was probably the game's best grappler. Now, to point out one teeny tiny little flaw with Abigail's grappler shenanigans, while his EX command grab does give him Oki, because it's not the command grab that's netting the knockdown, he can't deny the opponent's back rise, which can hurt his Oki. This is an issue, but to be fair, willingly putting yourself closer to the corner against this fucking thing is maybe not a decision to be made lightly, so I don't know. However, if Oki off a command grab that the opponent couldn't back rise was what you were looking for, then you had to look no further than Abigail's run grabs. The meterless run grab left you close and +5 after a dash, and the EX one left you point blank +4. To be fair, he also had this in Season 2, but that doesn't make it any less fucked up. Moving on to Abigail's medium normals, there's honestly not a ton to say, but that's not because they're bad by any means. They're mostly fantastic, with the exception of stand medium kick. This normal has never done anything for Abigail throughout Street Fighter V's entire lifespan. It did get buffed going from Season 2 to Season 3. It has a better hitbox than it did in Season 2, and it went from 0 on hit to +2 on hit, making it easier to press things after and giving a link on counter hit, although admittedly not a very useful one. This is supposed to be a poke, but you have to be very close to actually get the link, so I don't really see how this is useful. As a poke, this move is just completely redundant. It's too slow, too stubby, and doesn't lead to anything meaningful without a V-trigger cancel. The only noteworthy thing about it is the fact that it's his strongest medium at 80 damage, but even then, that doesn't really mean anything. This move was buffed again in the final balance patch, going from +2 to +5 on hit, and even then you never saw it. Abigail's other medium normals are pretty fantastic. It's just that they're not uniquely fantastic, so I don't have a ton to say about them. They're not that much better here than they are in the final version of SF5, it's just that they're on a much better character. Abigail's stand medium punch is an incredible pressure tool. It's +7 on hit, +5 on block, hits a frame late on most crouching characters, so it's +8 and +6 respectively, and it combos into itself on counter hit. It also has very solid range and very little pushback. In the final version of Street Fighter V, this move is actually at worst +8 on hit, which is actually quite nice. It makes the link to back heavy punch a bit more consistent, because that hits on frame 8 in its later active frames. In this version of the game, you have to be very close for the link to work, which is key because it's a very, very important link. Funnily enough, Abigail's stand medium punch is one of the few things in his kit that was strictly nerfed going from Season 2 to Season 3. It had its hurt boxes adjusted to make it a worse anti-air, which is totally reasonable. It was probably not ever meant to be an anti-air in the first place, so this makes perfect sense. Crouching medium punch is a phenomenal poke. Like standing medium punch, this is another move that was technically nerfed going from Season 2 to Season 3, getting its hitbox made smaller, but in practice it doesn't really matter. The horizontal range is the exact same, so this was probably done to stop it from like accidentally hitting people out of the air. It's also special cancelable, which can be potentially nice, although you don't get a combo from max range. You can cancel into flip to potentially net plus frames if the opponent respects it. And even if you don't think the opponent is going to respect it, there is some riskier stuff you can try. Crouching medium kick is another fantastic poke. It hits low, it's special cancelable, and unlike crouching medium punch, you can always combo off it at max range. And unlike the last two moves, this one was actually buffed going into Season 3, getting its hurt box reduced. It's a little slow at 12 frame startup, but one thing that was nice about this move is that it had a 16 frame special cancel window, so you could single hit confirm it into EX Abigail punch. Again, this has always been possible, and it's still possible today, but I feel like you didn't see Abigail players go for this until the later seasons. These were simpler times for Abigail. He had better things to be doing than reacting to things. He was just fine without that. Abigail's forward medium punch overhead hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. It's basically the same move it is now. Pretty slow, good range, +3 on hit, and -8 on block. Still, this move is the best it's ever been on this version of Abigail, because if it hits on its last active frame or counter hits, it's +5, and this version of Abigail is the best at getting a conversion in that situation. Now, before we get onto Abigail's heavy normals, I'd like to go on a little bit of a tangent and talk about his jump, specifically his forward jump. Now, in terms of mobility, it's not good, and that's fine. It shouldn't be given the kind of character he is, and his mobility is a genuine weakness. His walk speed is pretty subpar, his forward dash is tied for the slowest in the game at 25 frames, and in terms of distance travelled, his forward jump covers the least distance in the game by a huge margin, with characters like Young Zeku, Ibuki, and Bison jumping over twice as far. He also has the most pre-jump and landing frames out of any character at 8 and 6 respectively, which is the same as Melee Bowser, which is unrelated but I think is kind of cute. However, while Abigail's forward jump isn't great for mobility, it can be incredibly frustrating on offense. For a start, out of every forward jump in the game, his spends the least total time in the air at 36 frames. This, combined with the fact that some of his jump-ins hit very deep, especially jump heavy kick, can make him very hard to anti-air. This can be problematic even in the final version of Street Fighter V, but it's worse than ever here because the hitboxes and hurtboxes on some of Abigail's jump normals were absurd. Jumping heavy kick in particular was very notorious because it retracted Abigail's hurtbox before the hitbox appeared, and the hitbox itself was fantastic. That's Birdie's crouching medium punch, which at the time was maybe the single best one-button anti-air in the game. If you didn't have consistent anti-airs, you were completely cooked against Abigail. And if your anti-airs were a bit more committal, you could be in massive trouble, because Abigail's shallow jump but massive jump-ins meant that he could very easily bait committal anti-airs. This is such a terrifying situation, because you can't really afford to not anti-air Abigail. You can't let this character get in, you just can't let him jump at you. And wouldn't you know it, jumping heavy kick, this absolutely ludicrous button, was buffed going from Season 2 to Season 3, having its hurtbox reduced. And not only that, but the very same thing was done to jumping medium punch, a decent jump in its own right. And they weren't even the only jump normals to receive buffs going into Season 3. Abigail's jumping heavy punch had its hitbox expanded, and to be fair, using this as a jump in is a little bit tricky. You have to hit it quite deep to get it to work. But rightfully so, because it's the strongest jump in the game at 110 damage. The last notable jump normal to be buffed was Abigail's jumping medium kick. It received 2 extra active frames going from 3 to 5, and it had its hitbox expanded. This is Abigail's cross-up, and while he has to be pretty close to use it, it's incredibly good. It can be very hard to tell what side he's going to end up on. And on top of that, because it's a medium, it has enough hit stun to go into his mediums, which allows you to get much bigger combos. Moving on to Abigail's heavy normals, we've already talked about crouching heavy punch, so we'll move on to Abigail's stand heavy kick and crouch heavy kick, which both received minor improvements going into Season 3. Stand heavy kick has never really been that important of a normal for Abigail. It can work as a low crush, but it's quite slow at frame 18, and it's -8 on block. In Season 3, it was changed to give a much more lenient juggle state, although you really needed V-trigger cancel to get any kind of significant follow-up. And even then, juggles into crouching heavy punch, which were the most rewarding, didn't work at max range. In that scenario, you only got the first hit of sweep, which was unfortunately pretty weak. Speaking of sweep, that was typically preferred for activating V-trigger since it was faster, had more range, and left the opponent grounded. Going from Season 2 to 3, the first hit of sweep received an extra active frame, so it technically became a little bit better for this purpose, which is wild because it was already really good for it, although it is quite a minor buff. Now, I did mention earlier that it got some hitbox and hurtbox improvements going into Season 3, but either way, forward heavy punch isn't very good. It's not a very good anti-air, and while its frame data is pretty good, being +4 on hit and +1 on block, unfortunately it whiffs against the entire cast if they're crouching. So that pretty severely limits its utility. Its only real uses are in some niche V-Trigger 1 stuff and in juggles, and admittedly it is very good in juggles. Better in this patch than it is in any other version of the game. Back heavy punch on the other hand is absolutely monstrous. For a start, this is a frame 7 cancelable heavy, so it's fantastic in his combos. And it also has a target combo attached to it, and it's a very good one. You sacrifice a little bit of damage for good corner carry and fantastic Oki. Back heavy punch also had 1 hit of projectile durability, which on a character like Abigail was much appreciated. Granted, it wasn't as good of an anti-fireball tool as something like Zangief's headbutt. It had a good bit more recovery, although it did build you a fair bit of meter, and you could at least cancel it on hit, although this was rather committal. The combination of its good speed and target combo also make back heavy punch a fantastic whiff punishing tool. Now, to be fair, whiff punishing wasn't as prevalent in this version of SF5 as it was in the later versions, since buttons tended to have less recovery, but that wasn't a massive issue for some reasons we're going to talk about now. Everything I just said about back heavy punch also applies to back heavy punch in the final version of Street Fighter V, but don't get it twisted, this version of the move absolutely has some exclusive dirt. First of all, I did mention that earlier versions of Street Fighter V tended to be less focused on whiff punishing, and that absolutely applies to this move, because you're not whiff punishing this. Abigail not risking a ton by whiffing this button was unbelievable, because the combination of it being fast, very rewarding, and a heavy button, meaning it would beat medium pokes in trades, meant that he could use it less as a whiff punish tool, and more of a let's just hope I hit something button. Next up, we've got another very notorious button, and that's Abigail's standing heavy punch. It's very slow at frame 20, but it has more than enough to make up for that, especially in this version of the game. First of all, as you can tell, it's absolutely massive. It hits from over 2 backdashes away, and on top of that, it's actually safe on block at -3. It's also an extremely rewarding crush counter. From any range, you can dash in and get back heavy punch for Oki, or crouching heavy punch for damage. Now, again, pretty much all of that applies to the final version of this move as well, but this is the best version of it, and I'll get into why now. First of all, this crush counter is more rewarding here than it is in any other version of the game. The move itself does more damage and builds more V-meter on crush counter than it does in the final version. The crush counter scaling nerfs weren't in play yet, and in general, this version of Abigail gets the most damage and stun after a crush counter. So this move is basically the same as it is in the final version of the game on block, but it's more rewarding on hit here. But where it's maybe the most different is on whiff. This button is nigh on whiff punishable, it's absolutely disgusting. And look, I know I've already mentioned that the earlier versions of Street Fighter V were less focused on this kind of thing, but it really is absurd just how little Abigail risked by throwing this out. Especially considering how potentially massively rewarding it is. Anyways, let's move on to Abigail's specials. I've already touched on some of them, but there's still plenty worth pointing out. First of all, Abigail Punch. Abigail Punch is really just a combo ender for Abigail, and in this version of the game, wouldn't you know it, it's a better combo ender than it is in the final version. The damage of the meterless Abigail punches has never changed. They've always done 120, 130, and 140 respectively, although they do 50 more stun here than they do in the final version of the game. 200 versus 150. EX does 170 damage and 230 stun, which is 10 more damage and 30 extra stun than the final version of the game. What really separates Season 3 Abigail Punch from Final Season Abigail Punch though, is the fact that the meterless Abigail Punches all give you Oki in this version of the game. The light Abigail Punch gives you the worst Oki, leaving you +4 after a dash on Quick Rise, but the furthest away. Medium and Heavy leave you much closer, and after a dash on Quick Rise, you're +3 and +4 respectively. It's not perfect Oki or anything, but it's still terrifyingly good for the kind of character it's on. EX Abigail Punch gives you the most advantage, but the worst knockdown. You're +6 after a dash, but it sends the opponent very far away. In the corner, this one gives you the best Oki, but mid-screen, it's not ideal. A weird quirk of Abigail Punch is the fact that you had to mash punches during the move to increase its damage and stun. For the meterless versions, if you didn't mash, you lost 20 damage, 20 stun, got less advantage on knockdown, but were left closer to the opponent. All three versions left you +2 after a dash on Quick Rise. The EX version left you +5, but unfortunately it barely left you any closer than the mashed version. This was especially pointless since you lost 40 damage and 30 stun. In the game's later seasons, Capcom really tried to push this idea of intentionally going into the unmashed Abigail punch for better Oki, but it never really ended up working out. In the final version of the game, all 3 mashed, meterless Abigail punches leave you +1 after a dash on quick rise. This is a huge downgrade, and depending on the version of Abigail punch and the combo you use to go into it, you might not even be able to reach the opponent with your full frame normal, or a command grab. However, the unmashed versions left you +3 and closer to the opponent. It's a nice idea, but honestly I don't think they went far enough with it. You very rarely saw people go for this, and even with it, Abigail struggled to chase back rise quite a lot. The unmashed EX Abigail punch actually got an extra 10 damage, but they didn't do anything about the super wonky knockdown, so I've no clue what the thought process was here. Now, we've already talked about Abigail's run grabs, and they're great. Risky but very rewarding, better than they are in the final version of the game. But, surprisingly, Abigail's run flip is probably worse here than it is in the final version. Its utility or lack thereof basically hasn't changed at all. It's just a big fuck off very unsafe overhead. And as a combo ender, it's actually worse here. It's harder to go into and there's less incentive to do so. Although that is partially due to another EX move you could go into being incredibly fucked up in this version of the game, but we'll get there when we get there. He can also use parry during his run, which has always been a little hard to use effectively, and maybe a bit unnecessary since his run has 1 hit of armor, but it's definitely something you can go for. Also, if you did parry out of EX run, then you essentially got an EX parry, and EX run was the only place where you could use it. It was active on frame 2 instead of frame 3, you didn't have to choose between a high or a low parry, it just parried everything. It built a million billion V meter, and unlike the meterless parry, it could parry supers. It's not like a very important tool or anything, it's just really cool in my opinion. You almost never saw it, and you never heard anyone talk about it. I just think it's neat. Now, Abigail's run punch is definitely worth talking about because it did receive some notable changes going from Season 2 to Season 3. Now, the meterless version of this move isn't anything all that special. As a poke, it's a bit slow and a little bit unsafe, it's not super rewarding. It's very nice after anti-air crouching heavy punch where it's your most consistent ender, but in any other combo, there was almost always something else you'd rather do. Not a bad combo ender by any means, it's just that compared to some of your other options, the knockdown wasn't amazing, and you could get better damage. It's EX run punch where things get really problematic. It did the same damage as the meterless run punch and 50 less stun, but you could perform it out of run sooner, and it crumpled on hit. Now, to be fair, your options for comboing into this on the ground were very limited. It was basically just a successful parry. So if you wanted to land this, you would usually just do it and hope it landed. And this is where the issue comes from. You see, at the time, both run punches were -9 on block, which is definitely punishable for the most part. But for whatever reason, going from Season 2 to Season 3, not only did both run punches have their hitboxes increased, but they also had their pushback on block increased, which made them way harder to punish for a lot of characters. This meant that for just 1 bar, Abigail could throw out a move that was armored up until the frame before it hit, always crumpled the opponent on hit, he could always get a combo off, and most of the time, he'd fucking get away with it. EX Run Punch was one of the most belligerent moves in Street Fighter V's entire history, and surprisingly enough, this aspect of it wasn't nerfed until midway through Season 5. It really felt like this move crept under the radar, like people didn't realize just what they were dealing with until a lot of other things in Abigail's kit were nerfed. The EX Run Punch nerf was massive because Abigail not only lost the ability to space the move to make it safe, but he just lost his safest thing to do out of EX Run in general. Even in situations where you can't space it, Abigail can't traditionally cancel his run, so if you had to go into something, you'd generally rather go into punch. It's better to be -9 in close than potentially get a command grab jumped or a parry baited. But for EX run, that was just no longer an option. I've talked about Abigail's throws quite a bit at this point, but I do think it's worth mentioning that this patch featured the absolute best version of EX command grab by a landslide. This move was absolutely incredible, and it would go on to be nerfed several times in future patches, having its damage lowered, its range lowered, its potential follow-ups made worse, and being hit with a universal nerf in Season 5 to throws that started combos, where they'd inflict 2 ticks of scaling instead of 1. There's not a whole lot you can say about the meterless flips. They're all good moves for sure, it's just that they're good in the exact same way that they're good in the final version of Street Fighter V. They're all a bit slow, but they're at least safe and at best give you plus frames. The only thing that makes them better here is the fact that they've got a smaller mid-flip hurtbox than they do in the final version of the game. But they're overall just good. EX Flip on the other hand is a completely different beast. I've been using this move quite a lot throughout this video, and for good reason. It's absolutely obscene in this version of the game. This is a combo extender that does 120 damage and 200 stun. And granted, it was also that in Season 2. But the difference is that in Season 2 you would have followed it up with something like this. Or maybe this. However, thanks to Abigail Punch having more juggle potential compared to Season 2, in Season 3, you'd do something like this. This gave Abigail the single highest practical 1-bar damage in Street Fighter V's entire history. It was completely out of this world. And as if the damage wasn't enough, that one combo did 670 stun. That plus any meterless command grab is 920. Look, I know it's against Akuma, okay? But that's one fucking bar with no V-trigger! What is he doing? You spend a tiny bit more bar, or just, hit them instead of landing a command grab, and you're suddenly stunning real-ass characters from full. The only real issues of EX Flip are that the first hit has quite limited range, so you can't really do traditional grounded confirms into it. You pretty much just have to land a jump in. And the second issue is that you really did have to confirm into it, because the move was unsafe on block. Although, not in the way that most moves are unsafe on block, because if you let the full thing rock, it's only -2, which, save for things like GIF 720, is unpunishable. The second hit of this move is safe on block, but if you wanted to get the most out of it, you had to land the first hit, and there's a 7-frame gap between the two hits. And if you hit Abigail on frame 6 or 7 of that gap, you'd actually hit him on the ground, and you'd get a much better punish. Still, there's no denying that this is much better for Abigail than just having the second hit be punishable, and for some characters this was really awkward to punish. So EX Flip didn't have any crazy utility or anything, it just did a shit ton of damage and a shit ton of stun, and that's all it needed to do to be a massive factor in why Abigail was so monstrous. If he hit you with this, which wasn't hard for him to do, he'd do huge damage, get decent Oki, and if the opponent guessed wrong one more time, they could find themselves cornered, stunned, or dead. Honestly, this is kind of a theme with Abigail. He doesn't really have a lot of utility. He doesn't have a very complex game plan or a huge array of tools, and he doesn't need it. He's not really your traditional top tier. He's not a very solid or consistent character. He has bad defense, terrible mobility. It's just that in any situation where he does have the advantage, the risk reward is so skewed in his favor, it's kind of unreal. Where most characters in Street Fighter V were stunning you in 5, 4, maybe 3 interactions, Abigail was doing it in 2 or 3. And you know what, if those 2 or 3 interactions happened while you were cornered against him, you wouldn't really mind, right? That's where a character like him should really shine, so it is what it is. However, that's usually not how it would go down. Instead, 1 or 2 of those interactions would usually be some shit like this. And now you're cornered against Abigail, and you're 1 interaction away from getting stunned. So you might see the problem. Honestly, I feel like Abigail's mid-screen presence is where a lot of his most egregious tools really shined. Like, if he was playing defense or stuck full screen, he did legitimately struggle. And yeah, he was incredibly overtuned if he was right next to you in your face, but at the very least that's where you'd expect a character like him to really shine. But here's where things just got kind of silly. You want to jump at him? Uh-oh, that's an anti-air jab that he gets a 50-50 after. How'd that get in here? You want to anti-air him back? Well, good luck. Do you want to try and approach Abigail on the ground? Well, I hope you're hungry, because you'd be eating this all day. Do you want to try use some pokes of your own? Uh-oh, Abigail just pressed back heavy punch. You gave this man corner carry and a good-ass knockdown. Do you want to do literally anything against Season 3 Abigail? This is the thing with Season 3 Abigail. He had obvious strengths and obvious weaknesses, but on top of his strengths being, you know, way too strong, it was way easier than it probably should have been for him to get into a position where he could make the best use of them. This character's risk-reward was just completely skewed, which was wild because a character like him could afford to take risks. Playing against Abigail at this time was just so unbelievably stressful, because even if you played well, one mistake on your end or one something on his end, and suddenly he's making the comeback of the century. And that's not even factoring in something that we haven't talked about yet. Abigail's V-Trigger 1 in this version of the game is one of the best triggers in Street Fighter V's history, and to be fair, it was also incredible in Season 2, which once again makes it all the more surprising that it was actually buffed going into Season 3. It wasn't a massive buff or anything, but the trigger had its total duration increased. I can't give the exact numbers because Capcom used to be very vague with their patch notes, but if you let the whole thing rock, it went from lasting around 50 seconds to about 59. Now, while the main selling point of V-Trigger 1 is the power and utility of Abigail's now chargeable heavy normals, there's 2 other things this trigger did that you didn't see mentioned a whole lot. First of all, it gave him a flat 15% damage increase. This is horrific for plenty of reasons, but all I'll say is, thank God it's just damage and not stun that's getting increased here. It also noticeably improves EX Run. Outside of V-Trigger, EX Run has 2 hits of armor, and they're active from frame 3 onwards. While in V-Trigger 1, the move has 3 hits of armor, and the armor is active on frame 1. So it's a real reversal, although a bit of a wonky one. While in V-Trigger 1, Abigail can charge all 4 of his heavy punch normals to give them different properties on hit. Ignoring the 15% damage buff, they do the same damage as the uncharged versions, but they all get 50 extra stun. For some reason, both hits of the back heavy punch target combo got an extra 50 stun, which means after scaling, the whole thing does 380 stun, up from 285. If you were even a little familiar with SF5 at the time, you probably saw a combo like this at some point. Honestly, the back heavy punch target combo is one of the most egregious things about this trigger. It's not hard to go into at all. If Abigail ever gets a full EX flip, which on its own does a lot of damage and stun, he can go into the back heavy punch target combo and get an absolutely absurd amount. Oh yeah, and he gets Oki after too, because of fucking course he does. Another really messed up aspect of this trigger that mainly applies to stand heavy punch and crouching heavy punch is that if you fully charge them, while they won't change at all on hit, they become unblockable. Now to be fair, anything you do after landing an unblockable will be heavily scaled, and the fully charged versions of both these moves are quite slow, at frame 40 and 45 for crouch heavy punch and stand heavy punch respectively, and Abigail has very few knockdowns where he actually gets that kind of frame advantage. You're mostly going to be looking at like plus 30 if you're lucky. So outside of things like a YOLO crush counter sweep or the opponent simply missing their quick rise, Abigail had very little in the way of guaranteed unblockable setups, situations where the opponent will be forced to eat an unblockable the exact same frame they woke up. But honestly, he didn't need it. You see, another trick to Abigail's charged heavy punch normals is that while he's charging them, he has one hit of armor. This meant, unless you had something like an EXDP, you couldn't stop him from doing the move. If you wanted to escape the situation, you had to just get out of the way. This meant that in absolute worst case scenarios, a lot of characters' best options were to just hold the unblockable and accept they were going to eat some damage, or to try and jump out of the corner, which, depending on the state of their jump or the knockdown Abigail got, might not even be possible at all. And this is where things get really scary, because even in situations where you could get out of the way of a fully charged attack, Abigail could just go for a partially charged one. And even if you guess right, predict that Abigail's going to release a button early and block it accordingly, you're not completely out of the woods, because stand heavy punch is safe and crouch heavy punch is cancelable. You heard a lot of people say that V-Shift killed Abigail, and while that's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, it was massively detrimental to V-Trigger 1, because it gave the entire cast an answer to the partial versus full charged punch mix. You could just hold down back and delay your V-Shift, and you'd block any partially charged attacks, and V-Shift a full charge one. Now obviously there were situations where Abigail appreciates V-Shift, because it was the hot new defensive option on a character with bad defense. But overall, it was detrimental to him for sure. Even outside of him just being a better character in Season 3 compared to Season 5, he lost a lot from the addition of V-Shift. It's not like Abigail needed a knockdown or the corner to get the most out of V-Trigger 1 either, because it was incredibly lenient. He got 6 individual uses of his charged heavy normals before the trigger ran out, and he could so easily set up situations where the opponent had to do something to get away from him. And even if there were a few ways of doing that, it was just so incredibly stressful to play against in the moment. Especially knowing what could happen to you if you were wrong. Also, I don't know where else to mention this, but Abigail's chargeback heavy punch reflects projectiles. Not as important as the whole 380 stun and stealing your credit card information on hit thing, but it does do that. And also, V-Trigger 2. I should probably mention it just because this is Arcade Edition Abigail that we're talking about, and Arcade Edition is where V-Trigger 2, happened. But Abigail's V-Trigger 2 was not good at the time. It was never worth picking. It's just a headbutt that you can cancel into from V-Trigger cancelable normals and specials, and if you charge it all the way, it becomes unblockable. It's not a bad trigger by any means, just outclassed by V-Trigger 1, especially since V-Trigger 1 is a 2-bar V-Trigger and this is a 3-bar one. It does have some really nice qualities. It makes his light confirms a lot scarier for one. And getting anti-aired by this is the worst feeling in the world. It also had a better activation than V-Trigger 1, because you could cancel things like Abigail Punch and Run Punch, which you couldn't do with V-Trigger 1 at the time. Unfortunately, your combos out of the activation were worse than they are in the final game. Your combos off Meterless Abigail Punch activate aren't that much better, but god, the stuff you get off EX Abigail Punch in the final version of the game is so fun. I absolutely adore this stuff. This is one of my favourite things about the final version of Abigail. Also, in just the very first version of Arcade Edition, you could cancel the first hit of Abigail Punch into VT2 or VT2 Headbutt on hit or block. This was definitely unintentional, because it was fixed after just a couple of days. And good, because this would probably be super annoying. Being able to make Abigail Punch safe on block with the activation, or the headbutt, which is only -2, would probably be a bit much. And perhaps more alarmingly, it gave Abigail some setups where the opponent was forced to eat a fully charged, unblockable headbutt on wake up. Honestly, the main selling point of V-Trigger 2 was that it was his easier V-Trigger to use. And like, it's not like V-Trigger 1 was that hard to use, but you can't get much easier than just pushing 2 buttons at the end of anything you did and making your combo stronger or making anything you did safe. I loved this V-Trigger back in my Ultra Bronze days, and not only did I love it because of how easy it was, but I convinced myself that playing this Fisher-Price ass character was totally socially acceptable because I was intentionally using his worst V-Trigger. I was something else. Lastly, this is maybe a bit of an anticlimactic thing to go out on, but Abigail's super is basically the exact same here as it is in the final version of the game. The only direct change it's ever received was part of a universal change in Champion Edition, where blocking supers would now build you meter. Now, this super has always been incredible. It does 350 damage, it's really easy to combo into, and it's Abigail's only true invincible reversal. But once again, it's better here than it is in any other version of the game, and that's simply because of its mid-screen Oki. If Abigail dashes after super, he's +4 on quick rise, and the opponent can't back rise here. This is the same as the final version of the game, but the key difference is that Abigail's command grab actually reaches in this version. So they had to hold a 50-50 here. So that's Abigail in the release version of Street Fighter V Arcade Edition, and man, what a character he was. He had obvious weaknesses, and he wasn't the most consistent character, but it didn't matter because he was so unbelievably overtuned in the situations where he was strong that you just couldn't keep up with him. He was unbelievable. However, we didn't have this version of the character for very long, only about 3 months, and like I said, he spent the rest of Street Fighter V paying for his sins. So, I think it makes sense to get into what they did to him over the years now. Moving on to how they massacred my boy, let's start with some basic stuff. Here's every single normal that received Hurtbox nerfs going from Season 3 to the final season of the game. I know this maybe isn't the most informative or interesting way to get this information across, but I know this video is long enough as is, and it's probably not the most exciting thing in the world to just go through a bunch of normals and go, trust me, this is worse. Moving on to Abigail's health and stun, here's how Capcom have fiddled with both these values across multiple balance patches. And yes, you're looking at that right, in Season 4 they really looked at this guy and said, yeah, sure, give him the same stun as the fucking zombie, that makes sense. But in the final version of the game, he has 1075 health and 1050 stun. The same stun and 25 less health than the final version of the game. It's not awful, but it has always bugged me that he has the same health as Zangief in the final version, but 50 less stun. That feels a little off. Abigail's throw loop was removed in the Season 3.5 patch. You're still +18 on quick rise, but if you throw the opponent in the corner, you are much further away from the opponent. This is more of a universal nerf than anything else, since a lot of characters got a similar treatment, but still, it's a nerf nonetheless, and Abigail is much further away than he'd like to be. In Season 5, his stand jab was finally nerfed as an anti-air, expanding Abigail's hurtbox before the hitbox appeared. This was probably deserved, but you wonder if they should have maybe buffed his other anti-airs to compensate. His other anti-airs are rewarding, but they're slow, inconsistent, or parry, which has its own set of issues. Yes, they are very rewarding, but anti-air is a huge issue for Abigail in the final version of the game, especially considering his massive hurt box. Abigail's light confirms were destroyed in Season 3.5. While crouching light kick was still +5 on hit, stand light kick and crouching light punch were both reverted to 6-frame startup. Crouching light kick also had its pushback on hit increased, so while you could still go into stand light punch, if you were anything other than point blank, a combo into light Abigail punch would just whiff. And while EX Abigail punch was more consistent, you could kiss your 3-hit light confirms goodbye. On top of receiving more pushback, crouching light kick was changed to no longer be special cancelable in Season 3.5. This meant that while his light confirms were better off than they were in Season 2, his ability to punish moves that were -4 on block was much worse. Abigail's crouching light punch used to be an absurd poke, and while it's still great, it's been significantly nerfed across 2 separate patches. In Season 3.5, on top of going back to a 6-frame normal, the vertical reach of this move's hitbox on the 2nd and 3rd active frames was decreased, and it received an extra 2 frames of recovery, going from 10 to 12. And then, on top of that, in Season 5, this move became much more whiff punishable, as it received a larger hurt box during its recovery frames. Outside of the standard stuff like hurt box nerfs on crouching medium punch and both of his jump mediums, Abigail's other mediums were mostly unscathed. When it came to his heavy normals, however, he was nowhere near as lucky. First of all, in Season 4, the move gained an extra 5 frames of recovery on whiff, going from 30 to 35. And then, on top of that, the hurt box around Abigail's legs was expanded upwards during recovery, and said hurt box lingered for an extra 12 frames. And then, as if everything they did in Season 4 wasn't enough, the hurt box was expanded again in Season 5. Standing heavy punch and jumping heavy kick lost 10 damage going into Season 4, going from 100 to 90. Maybe warranted given how massive they are, but still, an unfortunate nerf nonetheless, especially combined with how many hurt box nerfs they received. Another aspect of Abigail's heavies that was nerfed in Season 4 was the V-meter build on crush counter. Stand heavy kick and crouching heavy punch were still the same, building half a bar respectively. But crouching heavy kick went from about 2/3 of a bar to half a bar. Although, to make it up to him a little bit, if he only got the second hit, it would now build half a bar instead of about 1/3 of a bar. The V-meter build for standing heavy punch's crush counter was reduced from about half a bar to 2/5 of a bar. Although, to be fair, this is more of a universal nerf. This is by a mile Abigail's safest crush counter, and a similar nerf was given to other safe moves that happen to be crush counters, like standing heavy kick from Birdie or Ken. What definitely wasn't universal and was more of just a fuck Abigail moment was the V-meter build on his V-skill being reduced, going from half a bar on a successful parry to about 1/3. Moving on to specials, I've already talked about some of the nerfs Abigail got for things like the stun and Oki on Abigail punch, but there's still plenty to talk about. Case in point, the absolute state of his command grab. First of all, in Season 3.5, the medium and heavy command grabs were changed to give the same knockdown as the light one, which used to have the worst knockdown of the 3. Here's the light command grab. And here's the heavy one. After this change, the only difference between the 3 is damage, range, and the funny thing Abigail says during the grab. Season 4 took things a step further and absolutely obliterated the range on all 4 versions of Abigail's command grab. That was the light one, the one with the most range. This was an unbelievably huge nerf for Abigail because it made holding down back against him so much less scary. Not only did you not have to worry about getting command grabbed after blocking 2 light normals anymore, but if he was anything other than point blank, you might not have to worry about command grab much at all. It's honestly kind of embarrassing. EX command grab was hit especially hard. This used to not only be his most rewarding command grab, but his furthest reaching, tied with the light kick command grab. In Season 4, it was changed to have the same range as the medium kick command grab. EX Command Grab also got hit in Season 3.5, having its damage lowered from 100 to 80, although this is actually a change that I can't convey here, since this was actually reverted in the Season 5 patch, and on top of that, the move actually gained an extra 20 stun. However, there was a catch, because as I mentioned earlier, Season 5 was also the patch that universally nerfed throws that could start combos, by applying extra scaling to the moves done after them. As a result, this was less a buff and more compensation. Compared to Season 3.5, this combo did 2 more damage, but 10 less stun. Funnily enough, the extra scaling is only applied when grabs start a combo, so if for whatever reason you're doing a mid-combo command grab, then yeah, this is actually a straight buff. Other than minor hurtbox nerfs, not a whole lot changed about the meterless flips, but EX Giant Flip is one of the single most nerfed moves in SF5's history. In Season 3.5, it had its damage lowered from 120 to 80, and its stun lowered from 200 to 150. Even just this would be massive, but there's more. Also in Season 3.5, meterless Abigail Punch had its juggle potential reverted to that of Season 2, which means that Abigail lost that sick new 1-bar combo he got. This, combined with the damage nerf on EX Flip, meant that his 1-bar damage was significantly worse than both Season 3 and Season 2. As a result, Abigail's 1-bar stuff ended up not doing a whole lot more damage than his meterless stuff, although at the very least it did do noticeably more stun. As a little bit of compensation, following up EX Flip with forward heavy punch into light flip was made easier. It was a little bit tight before, but it wasn't made any more effective when you actually got it. Funnily enough, while this move has always done 80 damage since Season 3.5, in Season 5.5, they increased the damage of its follow-up from 70 to 90. This is more of a cruel joke than a buff. It does absolutely nothing for Abigail. This feature of the move has zero utility. It's the kind of thing that you would get hit by once if you didn't know anything about Abigail and then never again. It feels weird calling this one of the most nerfed moves in Street Fighter V history, because realistically it just got a damage nerf, a stun nerf, you lost something you could do out of it, and then I guess it synergized poorly with other damage and stun nerfs that Abigail got. But like, damage and stun is Abigail, and in Season 3, if Abigail ever hit you with this move, there was a very realistic chance that you'd be guessing for stun or even game on the very next interaction, and after Season 3, that just wasn't really the case, even with ideal starters. I've already touched on one of the EX Run Punch nerfs, but it cannot be overstated just how much they destroyed this move in the Season 5.5 patch. First of all, they gave it an extra 20 frames of recovery on whiff or block, so it's gone from -9 on block to -29. It's so unsafe that even if you space it, most characters can just dash in and get a punish regardless. Because of how unbelievably unsafe it is, it's very tempting to cancel EX Run Punch into VT2 Headbutt, a safe special move that's only -2 on block. But unfortunately, Capcom thought of this. Usually, attempting VT2 Headbutt uses 1500 frames of your remaining trigger time, but if you cancel into it from EX Run Punch, that's increased to 2500. This was just mean, especially since EX Run Punch into VT2 on hit is super underwhelming. You don't have enough time to get a fully charged VT2 Headbutt. Abigail's EX Run received one other absolutely massive nerf, although this one's a bit of an outlier since it's not actually a nerf to anything Abigail had in Season 3. Abigail's stomps during EX Run actually have hitboxes. For the longest time, this was a complete gimmick since they didn't actually combo into each other. This move was completely overhauled in Champion Edition, and the stomps could now combo into each other at the cost of having their already low stun and damage cut in half. Now, you didn't have a ton of opportunities to go into stomps, mainly parry, anti-air crouching heavy punch, a crumple, or EX command grab. But if you did go into it, the reward was absolutely obscene. Abigail could get the corner from basically anywhere. It was absolutely absurd. This was maybe the single biggest buff Abigail ever got after Arcade Edition, which was much appreciated after Season 4 literally boiled this character alive. Although, apparently, it was a little bit too big of a buff because it got hit in the very next patch. Grounded stomps would now launch the opponent, meaning Abigail could no longer do stuff like parry into stomps into a crumple. And on top of that, you could now only get 2 of them, severely limiting his corner carry. Stomps were at their best when you could go into them on the ground due to the huge corner carry and the crumple you'd get afterwards, so after the nerfs you really didn't see this feature of the move used a ton, which was disappointing. After a crumple, Abigail usually just had better things to be doing. It was a lot of meter to spend after EX command grab, and it wasn't the most consistent pickup in the world after an anti-air. What's especially sad is that Abigail didn't even get to keep the souped up stomps until the next major balance patch. He got this nerf in a relatively minor patch that was mainly focused on fixing bugs and adjusting a lot of the newly added V-Skill 2s. All Abigail got out of this patch for the most part was this nerf, which is pretty sad. Moving on to V-Triggers, there's a very obvious nerf that's been staring us in the face this entire time. In Season 4, Abigail's V-Trigger 1 went from a 2-bar V-Trigger to a 3-bar V-Trigger. And on top of that, the trigger itself just became worse. Its total duration went from 3500 frames to 2800, a 20% decrease. As a little bit of compensation, your charged heavy normals use less V-timer than they did before. They drain it by 500 frames instead of 600. Accelerate! But it's still definitely a big nerf overall. In the final version of Street Fighter V, Abigail was the only character in the game with no 2-bar V-trigger, which kinda hurts his versatility when it comes to things like V-reversal and V-shift. Still, there are characters who are basically always picking their 3-bar V-trigger like Oro and Laura, but it's still worth pointing out. In the Season 3.5 patch, the stun output of all of Abigail's charged heavy normals was decreased from 200 to 150, including the second hit of his target combo. On top of just making them much less threatening overall, this removed his touch of stun combos. Accelerate! Crush you! Crush you! Abigail punch! The one exception is forward heavy punch, which to this day still does 200 stun if charged. I had no idea this was the case till starting work on this video, and honestly, that's awesome. This is by a mile the least utilized of his 4 charged normals, but it's really fun to find uses for. I'm a big fan of this. V-Trigger 1 did receive one very notable buff, and that's having its activation buff to be essentially the same as V-Trigger 2's, so you could go into it off Abigail Punch and Run Punch. This was a great change, but there was a catch. He got this in Season 5, which infamously was the very same patch that added a certain universal mechanic that VT1 Abigail fucking hates. V-Trigger 2 is in a bit of a similar spot. It has received some notable buffs over the years. In Season 3.5, all 3 versions got an extra 30 damage. And the uncharged version also got an extra 50 stun. In Champion Edition, the partially charged headbutt had its 30 damage buff reverted, which sounds bad, but it was actually done to compensate for a very cool buff. The time you needed to charge the move to get the partially charged version was decreased by a frame, which means you could combo into it off EX Abigail Punch. The timing's a little tight, but it's very cool. Unfortunately, while VT2 is fantastic for increasing your combo damage, a lot of its utility has been lost, just like VT1, because it's also very weak to V-shift. Overall, in the final version of the game, Abigail was almost always picking V-Trigger 2. VT1's cool, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with it still, but VT2 is just a much safer pick. It adds damage and stun to almost any hit that Abigail gets, and it's also got some neat utility in that it's safe, and it gives Abigail a powerful confirm off one of his safest pokes. So that pretty much does it for Arcade Edition Abigail, why he was fucked up, and the things they did to him over the years to make him not fucked up. There are a few other tools that are maybe worth mentioning, specifically his new down back heavy kick that he got in Season 4, and V-Skill 2. It's kinda hard to know what to say about these, since they have nothing to do with Arcade Edition Abigail. They're just brand new tools that were introduced after Season 3. I showed down back heavy kick earlier when talking about stand medium punch. In the game's final balance patch, Abigail gained the ability to link into this move off a counter hit stand medium punch, and honestly, in the final version of the game, this move's pretty cool. Its frame 10 has great reach, and it does 100 damage, more than most of Abigail's heavies. In the final version of the game, I like it a lot, but when it was introduced in Season 4, it was complete dog shit. It was slow at frame 13, had less range, and only did 90 damage. Again, it felt more like a cruel joke than anything, and considering how mean Season 4 was to Abigail, it probably was. I legitimately do not know where to start with V-Skill 2. It's a very bizarre move. It's really fun to mess around with, I'll give it that. In the right situation, it can enable some really powerful stuff. And while it takes 71 frames to set up, you can at least cancel some special moves into it. Notably EX Abigail Punch, which actually leaves you plus. Still, despite how much potential it might have had or how fun it was to use, you very rarely saw V-Skill 2 used in a serious setting, and the main reason why is simple. Opportunity cost. Abigail's V-Skill 1, especially after the stand jab nerfs, is the closest thing he has to a fast anti-air, and like I mentioned earlier, anti-air is a very weak area for final season Abigail. V-Skill 2 is a very unique and fun tool for Abigail, but V-Skill 1 is physically filling a hole in his game plan, and that's very hard to pass up. So, there you have it. That's everything that made Abigail such an absurd character in Street Fighter V Arcade Edition, and everything Capcom did to him over the years to make him much more reasonable. Maybe a little bit too reasonable in places, but hey, it is what it is. Still, just like the Gil video, I hope this didn't feel unnecessarily long. I'd understand if it did, especially since a lot of the reasons for Abigail being broken were not super complex. Still, I just really wanted to be thorough because 1, this is a version of the character that you cannot play as in the final version of Street Fighter V, and secondly, despite some jabs I've made at him or some of his dumber tools, I do actually really like Abigail. I think he's mostly been a very fun character, and despite the fact he's on the weaker side, I really like how he turned out in the final version of the game. Plus, I played him at my first ever local, played like a complete idiot the entire time, and nearly won 15 euro. So, hey, there's a bit of sentimental value too. Either way, I hope you really enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting, and here's a dumb combo that you had no reason to do that was in the game for about a week. Peace. That one combo did 670 stun. That plus any meterless command grab is 950. It's 920. It's 920. Fuck.